"We don't need dinosaurs like you holding us back," she said, flipping her hair like dismissing me was just another item on her to-do list. "My name is Frank Mitchell, I'm 61 years old, and I'd been the operations manager at Peterson Manufacturing in Columbus, Ohio for the past 20 years. Not the kind of guy who made big speeches or demanded the spotlight in meetings. Just the steady hand that kept everything running smooth at a company that made industrial equipment for factories all across the Midwest." I just smiled, nodded once, and walked out of Rachel's office. No arguments, no threats, no drama, just cleaned out my desk piece by piece while the younger employees looked away. Some of these people I'd hired as kids right out of high school. Now they had families, mortgages, and I'd trained every single one of them. But nobody said a word as I packed up 2 decades of my life into a cardboard box. James Peterson had built this company with his bare hands 38 years ago. Started with one old machine in his garage, built it into a $25 million business through pure hard work and a reputation for making equipment that lasted. He'd handpicked me to run operations when his health started going downhill. "You're the only one I trust not to cut corners," he'd told me. Now his daughter, Rachel, 30 years old with a business degree and 3 years of living in Los Angeles, had decided the company needed modernization and fresh thinking. Code for getting rid of anyone who remembered how things worked before. Computers replaced common sense. As I walked to my pickup carrying that sad little box of personal stuff, I felt strangely calm. Because what Rachel didn't know, what she hadn't even bothered to check, was that my employment contract had a very specific clause, one that James himself had insisted on to keep me from being stolen by competitors. A severance penalty equal to 12 months' salary plus benefits if I was terminated without documented cause. I put the box in the passenger seat and sat there for a minute, hands resting on the steering wheel. Through the windshield, I could see the production floor, equipment I'd maintained myself, systems I'd put in place, people I'd hired, all about to learn what happens when 20 years of knowledge walks out the door. I didn't slam the door or screech out of the parking lot, just turned the key, put the truck in drive, and headed home to call Bill Murphy, a lawyer buddy who'd been waiting for an excuse to take on a corporate case this straightforward. I'd never been the flashy type, married 32 years to my wife Karen before a heart attack took her 5 years ago. Raised 2 kids who were both doing well. Son in Phoenix working for an engineering firm. Daughter teaching 4th grade in Cincinnati. My life had been built around being steady and reliable. Same approach I'd brought to Peterson Manufacturing. James Peterson had been more than just a boss. In many ways, he was like the father I never really had. My own dad had taken off when I was 9, leaving my mom to raise 4 kids on a waitress salary. James had taken a chance on me back when I was 41, coming off a layoff from a dying steel plant with nothing but hands-on experience and a 2-year degree in mechanical engineering. "Certificates don't build machines," James had said during my interview. "People with skill and sense do." He'd promoted me to operations manager within 18 months. James and I weren't the types to go fishing together or grab beers after work, but there was a respect between us that went way beyond the workplace. When Karen got sick, he'd been the one to adjust my schedule without me even asking, making sure I could take her to every doctor's appointment. Family first, Frank, always. The first warning sign came about 18 months ago when Rachel started showing up at meetings, fresh out of business school, carrying a leather folder and wearing perfume that probably cost more than most people made in a week, talking about synergies and market disruption. I'd catch James wincing sometimes at her suggestions, ideas that would have destroyed our quality control or outsourced parts we'd always made in-house. But he never contradicted her publicly, just quietly fixed things afterward. "She needs to learn, Frank," he told me one afternoon, leaning against my office doorway. "Some lessons can't come from textbooks." The second warning was when James announced his retirement 4 months ago. Heart problems, he said, though I suspected it was more about pressure from Rachel. He looked beaten when he handed me the updated organization chart with Rachel's name at the top. "I made her promise to keep the core team together," he'd said, not quite looking me in the eye. "The experience you all bring is what makes this place work." I just nodded. but something in my gut tightened. The way James wouldn't look directly at me, like he knew what was coming but couldn't bring himself to warn me. The morning after my termination, I was sitting at my kitchen table, reviewing my employment contract with Bill when my phone rang. James's name lit up the screen. I almost didn't answer it. Almost. But 20 years of respect doesn't disappear overnight. Frank, his voice sounded strained. What the hell happened yesterday? Ask your daughter, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Not angry, just stating facts. I did. She said you were... He paused, searching for words. Resistant to the new direction. Said you were undermining her authority with the floor team. I said nothing. Just let the silence stretch between us. James knew me better than that. Knew I'd never undermined anyone. You're going to file, aren't you? He finally asked. Already have, I replied. Bill Murphy is handling it. James exhaled heavily. I told her to look at the contracts, told her before I stepped down that there were protections in place. Another pause. She said she cleaned house yesterday. You, Michael, Sandra, anyone over 50. My jaw tightened. Michael had been our head of engineering for 14 years. Sandra ran our quality control department like it was her personal mission, both irreplaceable. Is that the direction you wanted, James? Clearing out everyone who built the place with you? You know it's not, he said, voice tired. But I gave her control. It's hers to run now. I heard voices in the background on his end, one of them distinctly Rachel's, sharp and demanding. I've got to go, Frank, James said quickly. The call ended abruptly. I set the phone down and stared at my contract spread across the table. Section 12, paragraph 3. In the event of termination without documented cause as defined in Appendix C, employee shall be entitled to severance compensation equal to 12 months of current salary plus benefits. Bill had highlighted it in yellow. It's solid, he'd told me earlier. They'll either pay or we'll take them to court, where we'll win and they'll pay my fees too. I walked to the window overlooking my backyard. The oak tree Karen and I had planted when we first moved in 28 years ago now towered over the property. We'd nursed it through 2 lightning strikes and a disease that nearly killed it, patched it up, supported it, gave it what it needed to grow strong. Something shifted inside me. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about value, about recognizing what experience brings to the table, about respecting the foundation others built before you decided to renovate the house. I picked up my phone and called Michael, then Sandra. By noon, I'd spoken with every veteran employee Rachel had let go. Some were shell-shocked, others furious, all of them worried about their futures. Take a breath, I told each of them. Check your contracts. Call Bill. Then I made one more call. To David Ross, owner of Precision Industrial across town. A man who'd been trying to hire me away from Peterson for years. Still interested in that conversation? I asked him. 3 days after being fired, I sat across from Rachel and Peterson Manufacturing's corporate attorney in a downtown office. Bill Murphy beside me, his weathered briefcase open, my contract prominently displayed. This is ridiculous, Rachel said, not even looking at the document. We're implementing a new direction. That's cause enough. Bill, 69 years old, with the patient manner of a man who'd seen every corporate trick, simply pointed to the highlighted clause. Termination without cause, as defined in Appendix C, requires severance equal to 12 months' salary plus benefits, approximately $155,000 in Mr. Mitchell's case. The corporate lawyer, young guy named Kevin who looked fresh out of law school, scanned the contract with growing discomfort. Ms. Peterson, the definition of cause here is quite specific. Performance issues, ethical violations, criminal acts. He was resistant to change, Rachel interrupted, crossing her arms. That's insubordination. Where's the documentation? That's the second, Bill asked. Written warnings? Performance improvement plans? Because Appendix C requires a documented pattern, not a single instance. Kevin flipped through a thin folder in front of him, finding nothing. Rachel's face tightened. Fine. So we pay him a few months severance and move on. 12 months, Bill corrected. As stipulated. That's ridiculous, she snapped. We'll offer 4 months. Take it or leave it. I stayed silent, watching her. In that moment, she reminded me of her father, the same stubborn set to her jaw. But James's stubbornness had always been in service of building something. Hers seemed aimed at tearing down. Bill closed his briefcase. Then we'll proceed with legal action. Discovery should be interesting, especially regarding the simultaneous termination of multiple employees over 50. Kevin's eyes widened slightly. He leaned toward Rachel and whispered something urgent. She brushed him off. Before you make threats, Rachel said to me, ignoring Bill completely, you should know we're prepared to fight this. You'll be tied up in court for years. I finally spoke. I've got time. And we'll make it known throughout the industry that you're difficult, she added. Good luck finding another position at your age. That's when her father appeared in the doorway. I hadn't seen James since his retirement party. He looked thinner, grayer, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. Rachel, he said quietly, a word. We're in the middle of something, Dad. Now, not a request. They stepped outside. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I could see them arguing. James gesturing forcefully, Rachel's posture growing more defensive. When they returned, Rachel wouldn't look at me. Kevin, James said, prepare the severance agreement as written in the contract. Dad, Rachel started, not now. James turned to me. I apologize, Frank. This isn't how I wanted things to end. I nodded once. Nothing more needed to be said between us. As Bill and I stood to leave, Rachel stepped in front of me. This isn't over. I'll be reviewing all vendor relationships. Any company that hires you can forget about doing business with Peterson. James went pale at her words, but said nothing. I just nodded again, thinking about my conversation with David Ross the day before, about the partnership offer he'd made, about the niche market Peterson had been ignoring for years that Precision Industrial was ready to enter. You're right about one thing, I told her. It isn't over. The severance payment hit my account a week later, $155,000 minus taxes. More money than I'd ever seen at once. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt hollow. Money wasn't the point. Neither was revenge, really. It was about something deeper. That same afternoon, I met Michael Davis, our former head of engineering, at a diner halfway between our houses. The place was nearly empty at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Just a couple of truckers at the counter and us in a back booth. Bill got me 8 months severance, he said, stirring his coffee without drinking it. Not as good as your deal, but better than nothing. They want me to sign an NDA, though. Can't talk about proprietary processes or business practices for 3 years, Michael nodded. He gave a bitter laugh. 35 years in engineering, and suddenly I can't talk about my own work. You signing it? Don't see much choice. Got a grandson starting college next year. I pushed a business card across the table. David Ross, Precision Industrial. He's looking for a consultant, someone who understands precision hydraulics. No NDA required. Michael stared at the card. Peterson would sue me if I took this. Not if you're just advising on general industry standards. Nothing proprietary about that. He pocketed the card slowly. What's going on, Frank? This isn't like you. Stirring the pot. I hadn't told anyone about my arrangement with David yet, but Michael deserved to know. We'd worked side by side for over a decade. I'm partnering with Precision, I said quietly. David's bringing me in as operations director. We're expanding into specialized hydraulic components. The small batch high-margin stuff Rachel thinks is a waste of time. Michael's eyebrows shot up. The custom work. James always said that was Peterson's future. And Rachel's killing it to focus on mass production. Thinks she can compete with overseas manufacturers on price. She can't, Michael said flatly. Not with our labor costs. I know, so does James. Michael leaned forward. Is that why you're telling me this? You think James is involved somehow? I shook my head. No, but I had lunch with Sandra yesterday. She said Rachel's been cutting the custom work department, laid off half the specialized machinists last month. That's 15 years of experience walking out the door, Michael said, eyes wide. Michael sat back, understanding dawning. She's gutting the profitable divisions. I nodded. Focus on high-volume, low-margin work that any overseas shop can undercut. We sat in silence for a moment, both processing what this meant, not just for us, but for the 80-plus employees still at Peterson. For James's life's work. What are you going to do? Michael finally asked. Build something better, I said simply. Something that respects both the past and the future. With David Ross? Michael sounded skeptical. David's got his own operation. Been running Precision Industrial for 20 years. That's right. He's not some investor looking for a quick return. He knows the business, wants to expand into the custom market, but needs the expertise. And let me guess, you need an engineer who understands hydraulics. I smiled for the first time in weeks. The position's yours if you want it. Once your NDA expires, of course. Michael studied me. This isn't just business for you, is it? It's personal. It's about value, I said. About building something that lasts. That's all I've ever wanted to do. 2 months after my firing, I sat in David Ross's office reviewing expansion plans for the facility. David had been running Precision Industrial for 20 years. Built it from a 3-man shop into a solid regional player. But he'd always focused on standard components. The custom hydraulics market was where the real money was. Machine shops confirmed, David said, spreading contracts across his desk. They can deliver the first 4 units by next month, and the CNC programmer starts Monday. David gave me a knowing look. Former Peterson employee, you said? You recommended him? I nodded. Tony Martinez had been at Peterson for 8 years. Brilliant with computer modeling, criminally underpaid. Rachel had cut his department's budget by 40% while doubling her own salary. He'd quit 3 weeks ago. How many does that make now? David asked. 5, I replied. All top performers. David whistled low. Peterson's losing talent fast. People follow good leadership, I said. Rachel's not providing it. My phone buzzed, a text from Sandra, still working in Peterson's lab, but feeding me information. With her retirement 2 years away, she couldn't afford to leave, but she could certainly keep her eyes open. The message contained a photo of an internal memo. Production delays, quality control issues, 2 major clients threatening to pull contracts over missed deadlines. I showed it to David, who adjusted his reading glasses to see better. Just as we predicted, he said. The brain drain's affecting output already. I pocketed my phone, feeling no satisfaction in the news. Peterson employed families I'd known for years. People with mortgages, kids in college, parents in nursing homes. Their suffering wasn't my goal. We should reach out to Midwest Manufacturing, I said, referring to one of Peterson's biggest clients. Let them know we'll be operational in 6 weeks. David nodded, making a note. Already scheduled a meeting for next week. Their purchasing manager's eager to talk. I stood and walked to the window, overlooking the production floor below. Workers were installing new equipment alongside David's existing operation, the foundation of something that could compete. My phone rang, James Peterson's name on the screen. I should take this, I told David, who nodded and stepped out, closing the door behind him. James, I answered. Frank, his voice sounded tired, defeated. We need to talk. I'm listening. A heavy sigh. I know what you're doing. The partnership with Precision, the Peterson employees you're hiring away. I said nothing. It wasn't illegal, wasn't even unethical. Just business. I'm not calling to ask you to stop, James continued. I'm calling to ask for help. That caught me off guard. What kind of help? The kind that might save what's left of my company. He paused. Rachel's been making cuts that don't make sense. The board's starting to ask questions. So am I.
Why tell me this?
Because you're the only one who knows every part of the operation, the only one who might see a path forward.
Another pause.
And because I should have listened to you months ago when you warned me she wasn't ready.
I closed my eyes, thought about all those years working alongside James, building something we were both proud of, something that employed hundreds of people who trusted us to make good decisions. What exactly are you asking, James?
Meet with me and a few board members. Informal discussion, no commitments.
His voice strengthened slightly.
They want to understand what's happened, what we might do about it. I looked down at the production floor again, at David's solid, profitable operation, at the opportunity we were building together. When and where, I said finally. Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, my house. Just a conversation, Frank. I'll be there, I said, but I'm not promising anything. Fair enough. Relief evident in his voice. And Frank? Yes? Thank you for still taking my calls. 8 months after being fired, I sat in Bill Murphy's office across from James Peterson and 2 board members. The mood was tense but respectful. James looked older, worn down by the stress of watching his life's work deteriorate.
The numbers speak for themselves,
said Robert Chen, the board chairman, sliding a financial report across the table.
Revenue down 38%. 3 major contracts canceled. Quality complaints up 200%.
I scanned the report. It was worse than I'd thought.
The question,
continued Margaret Walsh, the other board member,
is whether the situation can be turned around.
It can, I said simply, but not with the current leadership structure. James shifted uncomfortably.
What would you recommend?
Bring back the experienced team. Rebuild the custom work division. Stop trying to compete on price with overseas manufacturers and focus on what Peterson does best: quality, service, and specialized solutions. Would you consider coming back? Robert asked directly. I looked at James, then back at the board members. Not under the current arrangement, no. What if the arrangement changed? Margaret asked carefully. Bill leaned forward. My client would consider a management position with significant operational authority and equity participation. How significant? Robert asked. 25% equity stake, 5-year management contract, and full authority over operations and personnel decisions. James's eyes widened. It was a big ask. But then again, his company was dying. The board would need to approve any equity transfer, Margaret said. Of course, Bill replied, and we'd want to see the current shareholder breakdown. Robert and Margaret exchanged glances. James currently holds 51%. Rachel has 24%. The remaining 25% is held by our pension fund and small investors. James would need to transfer some of his shares, Bill said, and Rachel's role would need to be redefined. The room went quiet. James stared at his hands for a long moment. She's my daughter, he said finally. And this is your life's work, I replied. You have to decide which matters more. 3 months of negotiations later, the deal was done. I walked into Peterson Manufacturing as the new chief operating officer with a 25% stake in the company and full operational control. James remained as chairman. Rachel was moved to a strategic development role with no operational authority, and the board had oversight of major decisions. The first order of business was calling back the talent. Michael returned as head of engineering. Sandra came back to run quality control. Tony Martinez was promoted to lead the expanded CNC department. One by one, the experienced team reassembled. The second order was rebuilding relationships with clients who'd lost faith in Peterson's ability to deliver. It took time, but slowly the contracts started coming back. A year after the restructuring, I stood in Peterson's expanded facility, watching our latest project take shape. A custom hydraulic system for Midwest manufacturing. The kind of high-margin specialized work that had always been Peterson's strength. James joined me on the observation platform, moving more slowly than before, but with a spark in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Quarterly numbers came in, he said, handing me a report. Best in 3 years. I nodded, scanning the figures. Profit margins up, employee retention solid, new patents pending. Rachel called yesterday, James said quietly. From Los Angeles. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She's doing well out there, marketing consulting, says she's learned a lot about what she didn't know before. Good for her. She asked if she could visit sometime, not to work, just to see what we've built. It's your company, James, your call. James smiled. Our company now. And I think I'd like that. Below us, the machinery hummed with the rhythm of productivity, experience and innovation working together, not in opposition, but in harmony, building something meant to last. You know, Frank, James said, when I wrote that severance clause in your contract, I thought I was protecting the company from losing you to a competitor. I smiled. You were, just not the way you expected. Some lessons cost more than you think you can afford to pay, but the ones that teach you what really matters, those are always worth the price.